Your brain is a supercomputer housed within your skull, packed with over 100 billion cells and trillions of connections between them. It's an absolute marvel, and it belongs to you. The human brain can make complex decisions, learn thousands of words, make billions of calculations per second, and still keep your heart rate, your temperature, and so much more in check. So, what keeps this incredible engine running, and where can things go wrong? In this episode, we'll be exploring the inner workings of the brain. We'll talk about the overarching structure of the brain, as well as the physical cells that wire together to generate your thoughts and your mood. We'll explore the neurotransmitters and other molecules that play upon this massive web and change how you see the world. And we'll talk about how this information can help us to enhance and protect our brain health. I'm so excited to share with you this illuminating episode. It's all about your brain and its incredible potential. I am Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and this is the Better Brain Blueprint.
Having a healthier brain feels empowering.
Limitless.
Inspiring.
It feels peaceful and it feels hopeful.
It is so essential to your health.
Your brain is your greatest asset.
Improve your brain.
Improve your brain.
Improve your brain.
Improve your life.
Improve your life.
There is no alternative.
Live better longer.
You deserve that.
In this episode, we'll be covering powerful, life-changing information. Remember, if you want full access to the Better Brain Blueprint now and for years to come, you can invest in the entire series, along with the exclusive bonus materials right now for a special price that is only available during this broadcast. Don't wait. Your brain will thank you. At a basic level, our brains are made up of atoms, which are grouped into molecules, which make up cells, which are linked together into an organ. But when it comes to the brain, there's far more to the picture than just a bunch of neurons. You don't need to have a PhD in neuroscience to be dazzled by the parts of the brain. Having a basic understanding of their role is a great way to set the stage for understanding how things can go wrong and where things can go more right. So what are the major parts of the brain? The things you can see on scans like an MRI or a CT. And what do they do? Each of our brains have 4 major lobes on each side, so 8 overall. These include the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, the parietal lobes, and the occipital lobes. In addition, there's the cerebellum, which sits at the back or base of the brain next to the brainstem. And all of these lobes have to be powered by constant energy and oxygen delivered by our blood vessels. Let's hear more from Luisa Nicola.
So when I talk about the structural components of the brain, I'm talking about the hardware. I'm talking about the actual brain vessels, for example, that make up the brain. And when I talk about functionality, we've got 4 lobes in the brain. Then we've got the cerebellum, which you can consider maybe a 5th lobe. And they all have different various functions that they're responsible for. So that's what I mean when I say functionality. But let's talk about the structural components first, and we'll do a brief anatomy. So we've got this large vessel that comes out of the heart, and it's called your aorta, and everything from there just branches out into your brain. So we've got 2 main blood vessels that branch out of the aorta that go into the brain. And we've got the vertebral arteries, which sit at the back, and then we've got the carotid arteries. So you've got 1 on each side. They go into the brain, and then we've got branching out of these little vessels after that. And when I say the vasculature of the brain, I'm talking about veins, capillaries, and blood vessels. So they're the 3 things that I'm going to be speaking about. And it's actually funny. There's a really nice fact. If you were to pull apart the blood vessels of the brain, pull them all apart, it would span around 400 miles, which is quite large, right? So the brain is the most vascular rich organ in the entire body. So it's filled with millions and millions of tiny little blood vessels. And this is what is delivering blood to our brain. What is blood delivering? It's delivering oxygen and nutrients. So we need to be doing certain things to be getting as much blood to our brain as possible. I think it's really important that people understand what each lobe of the brain is responsible for, so then they can target these areas of the brain, because we know we can do this through different types of training. If we have a look, at the frontal lobe, it sits right at the front of the brain, behind your forehead. I always, give a brief analogy. Just, put your put your hand just on your forehead, and your frontal lobe is like the size of your palm. Now, it's the largest part of your brain, the largest lobe. And when I say largest, I don't mean just in diameter. I mean, it houses the most amount of neurons. So it's a very busy lobe, and it houses the prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of our brain. Many people have heard of that. They're like, the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of our brain, it houses our executive functions. But what exactly is that? When I talk about executive functions, I'm talking about decision making, information processing speed. So the way that you see a ball, for example, and process the fact that it is a ball. This is thinking. This is focus. This is attention. These cognitive functions that every single person in this world has and needs. But then if you look at another area, let's just say we go all the way to the back of the brain and we've got the occipital cortex. Now, this is mainly responsible for visual processing. And I think that every single person should be training that aspect of the brain. And it's just like training your biceps or training your entire arm, right? So you can imagine your bicep just being one lobe, but your arm encompassing the entire aspect of it, just like your entire brain. We can train our entire arm, okay? We can go to the gym, we can do hypertrophy training, and we would build muscle. But if you just focus on the bicep, which is it's made up of two groups of muscles. If we just train those, it's going to fundamentally get stronger. So that's how I think about the brain in theory, just training every single aspect of it rather than training it globally.
In addition to the frontal lobes and occipital lobes, we have two temporal lobes, which are located along the sides of our brains. Our temporal lobes are key to memory, to emotion, to hearing, and language comprehension. They're also notable because they house the hippocampus and the amygdala. Now, you may have heard about the amygdala due to its role in emotional processing and mood issues like depression and anxiety. We'll discuss it more in future episodes in this context, but it's likely more important that you know about the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is a very important part of the brain. It is seen by many as the memory center of the brain. And many studies have shown that the hippocampus, which is a very primitive part of the brain, is located deep inside the medial temporal lobes, which are really the core of the brain from the inside out, and is incredibly important for learning and for memory formation. It's that one part of the brain where memories are consolidated and then being redistributed to the rest of the brain. So it's really when whatever you pay attention to has the opportunity to be consolidated and become a permanent memory.
After the temporal lobes, there are the parietal lobes. These are located a little behind the frontal lobes and in front of your occipital lobes. Your parietal lobes are essential to sensory processing of data like touch, taste, and smell, visual processing, as well as the ability to read. It's not often that we appreciate just how amazing our brains are, but the second something goes wrong, it becomes immediately apparent just how complex our brains really are. With every thought, you're activating a diverse network of neurons. With every feeling, you're experiencing the strength of trillions of interlocking connections. Let's explore the unbelievable world that exists between your ears.
So many fun things are happening inside your brain. Firstly, it's an organ that controls everything else. So really, anything that the rest of your body is doing is also controlled by the brain. It's kind of like the master of the body because all of the functions of your body are happening there. So there are chemical reactions and all sorts of neurotransmitters interacting and synapses and fun things. A fun way to think about it is, when you think about it through the lens of food, how you're eating is impacting your brain. Let me give you a good example. Many of us may be walking around with mild changes in our brain and nothing may happen to those changes. But in some of us, depending on lifestyle factors for one, genetics, environment, and other things for another, some of these changes may evolve into neuroinflammation, cognitive disorders, and even dementia.
Let's get back to the question of what's actually in your brain. If you were to hold a human brain in your hands, the way I did in my anatomy lab, you'd be looking at around 2 or 3 pound organ. made up of mostly fat and water. Yet this seemingly basic makeup doesn't even come close to describing what's actually in our brains. If we peer closer into the physical makeup of these 2 to 3 pounds and ask about the cell structure, we start to see some amazing things. One of the biggest breakthroughs in brain science is the idea that while around half of the cells in your brain are neurons, the other half are cells called glia that are fundamental in every aspect of brain health and function. A glial cell subtype called microglial cells are getting a lot of attention because they're immune cells that reside within the brain, regulating things like inflammation and neuronal health, and responding to our environments. This is really important news because it helps connect the dots between inflammation and brain health.
When I look at what we have seen as frontier new areas of discovery as it pertains to brain function and brain physiology, one of the most interesting to me is this emergent increasing recognition that the brain has its own immune system. I don't believe that that was a topic that was well discussed when I certainly was in my medical training or even in my doctoral work as a PhD. And it was really, for me, an article that appeared in Scientific American in 1987 that was titled "The Brain's Immune System." And so this was kind of, what would you call Scientific American as a magazine, as a journal? It would not be a scientific journal, but it wouldn't be a lay throwaway periodical. It was somewhere in between, a hybrid. But by the time it gets to Scientific American, you would think, well, then it must have gone through many levels of understanding and acceptance because this is going to be for a more general readership. However, what I found when I took that article out into discussions in various seminars that I was giving back in the 80s, nobody in the medical world that I was speaking to was aware that the brain had an immune system. So it was almost like a contradiction to me because I thought, how could it get in Scientific American, but yet the medical practitioners, many of who are considered to be kind of the cutting edge of new concepts in medicine, were not aware that the brain had these microglia and that, well, they were aware that the brain had microglia, but the microglia had a role to play as the brain's immune system. And that coupled with a secondary discovery, because when I learned about the brain, we spent a reasonable amount of time talking about the blood-brain barrier, this semi-permeable, selective, membranous connector to the body whole, to the brain, that provided this insulation of the brain from what was going on in the rest of the body. That was kind of the paradigm by which I was educated. And I think it was not just me. I think many people were learning that the blood-brain barrier really kind of defended the brain against exposure to the rest of the stuff the body might get. And it had its own kind of patency that was isolated and selective and reserved in a club membership that was in the brain alone. So then we learned that, no, actually, that's not totally true, that the blood-brain barrier does exist, certainly, but it is semi-permeable, and it does have the ability to transport molecules, particularly lipophilic type of molecules, and therefore it is not entirely isolated from the brain, from the body. And of course, I guess we would know that in a simplistic way because there are drugs that have an effect directly on the brain that somehow had to cross the blood-brain barrier. Once we have an understanding that the brain has its own immune system that interrelates and intercommunicates with the body's immune system in general, it opens up the door for all sorts of questions about what are the ways that one might modulate, modify, or influence the brain's immune system systemically. And I find it interesting that there is now pretty strong evidence that many of the antidepressants, the SSRIs, their mechanism of action is more than just influencing serotonergic reactions, but they also are anti-inflammatories. They influence the brain's immune system, which then begs a question, doesn't it, as to, well, just a minute, maybe things like depression are associated with interrelationships with the brain's immune system that causes neurological changes that we seen in the outcome phenotype as depression. And so once you start asking those questions, it's a deep hole to dive into, because now we would ask the question, well, what are all the ways that one might modulate those cells within the brain's immune system by way that we live, eat, act, and move in our environment?
Another important theme as it relates to our brains is the idea of networks. As much as it's tempting to believe that our brain lobes work in isolation, we now know that our brain is packed with networks of connected neurons that can span across lobes of the brain. Let's talk about one network in particular that is a great example of this concept. It's called the default mode network, or DMN.
The default mode network is a network of parts of the brain that are talking to each other over time, usually measured at rest. And we typically see this network and we study this network in what we call like live brain imaging scans or functional MRIs. And what these do is when we have somebody at rest, you have a chance to look at what parts of the brain are lighting up at the same time or not, and what are they, and talking to each other. And so studies to date have shown that when we are at rest in these scanners, that there's a certain common network, meaning a common network in the brain, meaning a certain parts of the brain that are generally talking to each other in a similar way, that we call the default mode network, because it's the parts that are talking at rest. And that part of the brain has a lot of functions, but one of its functions seems to be to help create the structure of our sense of self, or our ego. And that sense of self is effectively like when I think of myself as me, or protecting me, or doing something in my own best interests, those kinds of things are in some ways represented by that part of the brain. And we know that now there is a role there because from psychedelic research with psilocybin and some other molecules over the last 20 years, some of which were great studies conducted by Robin Carhart Harris and others, we've seen evidence that when you give people psychedelic medicines and they rate how much less sense of self they are feeling before and after, we see a direct, and I think during as well, we see a direct relationship between feelings of loss of sense of self and connection to everything else around them that correlates directly with decreases in default mode network activity. It doesn't mean the brain is less active. It means that it's active in more and different ways that are not the default network that we have when we're sober at rest. So that is some interesting new data that we're seeing that is starting to shed some light on what these networks are important for.
With trillions of connections between our neurons, the number of unique ways that a person's brain could be wired it's almost beyond our comprehension. This explains why there are no two people who think, act, and behave in exactly the same way, even twins. Despite the incredible variability in our brain wiring, we tend to have some pretty rigid ideas about how a person's brain is supposed to function. One great example is how we measure intelligence and how we expect everyone to learn and process data in more or less the same way. But there's obviously more to being smart than just getting a high SAT score.
So the old model of intelligence, and measuring intelligence is kind of dated. People use, as you mentioned, standardized tests, or they use IQ tests. And when you go look at a standardized test, let's take in the US, you have like the SATs, right? Which primarily test for two areas, which is your verbal linguistic and your mathematical, right? And there's so many other forms of intelligence, right? What about the people who are kinesthetic, the great dancers and the great choreographers and the great martial artists and the athletes? What about musical intelligence, right? What about interpersonal intelligence? People who just have this gift of working with people and understanding people and influencing and leading. There's visual spatial intelligence. What about the people who are great artists and architects and graphic designers, right? So what I realized that in school, it's not how smart you are, it's how are you smart. It's not how smart you are, it's how are you smart. It's not how smart your kids are, it's how are they smart. It's not how smart your team is, it's how are they smart. And so the past couple of years, this will be in my new upcoming book, which is all about brain types. And these are your cognitive types. And we made a fun way for people to discover how they are smart. And so they can remove the judgment from themselves, because it's a strength-based approach where we really honor the traits that we have. Like some people happen to be right-handed, and if you're trying to learn something with your left hand, like if I ask you to write, everyone right now, to take a piece of paper, and I hope everyone's taking notes if they can, write your first and last name with your dominant hand. And I ask you to switch hands and write below it your first and last name below it. That second time is going to take longer. It's going to feel awkward and it's going to feel uncomfortable. The quality is probably not going to be as good. And so sometimes if you want to learn something, even if you're interested in the topic, I bet someone who's listening right now could remember a time when they were learning something and they genuinely are interested in the topic, but they're not getting it because the way the teacher prefers to teach is different the way they prefer to learn. And I'm just kind of illustrating this on video. Their hands are just like, imagine two hands or two ships passing in the night. There's no connection. They don't even see each other that's there. So maybe it's a learning disability. Maybe it's a teaching disability, where it's different. It's a different language.
What we're talking about here is more than a one-size-fits-all solution. Each of us has a unique brain that learns and experiences life in a different way. Getting to know our own brains and the ways that they function is an amazing way to optimize them. This is more than just about general brain health. This is about maximizing your brain's potential. In order to convey such incredible amounts of data between billions of neurons and glial cells, our brains need to use both chemical and electric data. When it comes to chemicals that transmit information, there are several groupings and methods for description. For example, you have excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate that increase the chances that a signal gets through, inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA that have the opposite effect, then a group of molecules called neurohormones that includes oxytocin, as well as better known neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and epinephrine. This is complex science, but it's what's happening in your brain right now that's influencing your thoughts and your actions. One important note to make is that it's easy to try to use neurotransmitters to explain complex issues, but problems with the brain are almost always more intricate than a simple neurotransmitter deficiency.
As far as the relative importance of the various neurotransmitters, of course, they're all incredibly important. And so, one of the things that came out of the research and that is so important for translation is to understand that you have this amazing network, and anything that you take away from it is going to be harmful. So, if you've got problems with not enough serotonin, that gives you one problem. Not enough dopamine, a different problem. Not enough acetylcholine, a different problem. Not enough glutamate, another problem. Not enough GABA, another problem. And, then you can go down all the peptides, and neuropeptide Y, and substance P, and all these amazing things. ADNP, all these. So I think it's always tough when you're dealing with this incredible network, but for our interest especially in memory storage and memory formation, you're going to have big problems if you don't have enough acetylcholine, which is one of the reasons that we are most of us, deficient in choline.
There's a whole lot of neurotransmitters in the brain. They are all important. We sometimes talk about some more than others, but I think the most important thing to note is that for the most part, every single study looking at neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain in mental health and in specific disorders, for example, depression, of which one of the world's largest studies came out last July, which is called an umbrella study, which is in over 100,000 people looking across almost every study that's ever been done, looking at neurotransmitter imbalances in depression and the relationship. And they showed definitively that there is no relationship between neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain and depression. So what is related to people getting depression? Having traumatic experiences that are not supported and not processed. That seems to be the single most likely thing that will lead you to have a diagnosis of depression. So while many neurotransmitters are important, and while certain drugs can help change neurotransmitter activity in the brain for certain amounts of time, and that can help stabilize or even treat certain people with mental illnesses, the brain has its own way of creating and regulating naturally its neurotransmitter milieu and function, and almost no one on the face of the earth, not no one, but almost no one, like probably what we're seeing is it's less than 0.1% of everyone who's ever been diagnosed with a mental illness like depression has a genetic reason for their depression. So that means that 99.9% of people who are diagnosed with depression do not have a neurochemical imbalance in their brains that they were born with that's causing their depression. So that's really important to understand because it tells us that we can actually change the outcome of our illness. That's the single most important thing to know about almost all mental health disorders and what we've learned from modern neuroscience.
One of the most transformative concepts in neuroscience is the idea of neuroplasticity. Basically, neuroplasticity describes the idea that our neurons are always rewiring, changing each moment in response to new information. This means that with each passing second, we're given the chance to either wire our brains for better health or allow them to be wired for poor health. Neuroplasticity is thought to be a governing factor in both health and disease, with implications for depression, dementia, learning, memory, and so much more. There's a very powerful study on neuroplasticity that was conducted on taxi drivers that provides a compelling illustration of just how amazing this concept is. Jim Quick does an amazing job describing this study in his book, Limitless.
In Limitless, I talk about a study about taxi drivers in London and how they have to go through rigorous training and education to be able to pass the test to be drivers, and they can memorize these map systems, which are obviously highly complex. And because they were going through these new learnings, that there was novelty, there's this neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's capability to be able to form new connections when presented with novelty and the right nutrition. It's kind of like the brain is an organ, but it acts a little bit more like a muscle. As we talked about, it's use it or lose it. And the more you use it, the stronger it actually becomes. So with the London taxi drivers, they had certain parts of their brain more dense. If you would imagine when this idea, which I didn't come up with, but the neurons that fire together, they tend to wire together. When you're presented with new stimulus and use discipline and deep work, novelty from reading books or podcasts or study, then you can make new connections. And that, imagine you have a thought and it metaphorically creates like a little pathway between here and there in a field. And then you have that thought again, or that behavior or that feeling, and it kind of gets more treads on it until it becomes like an information superhighway, and you become almost habituated to it, and it becomes like more your reality. And this plastic, in a good way, that your brain is malleable, this neuroplasticity is really the basis that why we could change, right? That we could grow older, but we could grow wiser also as well. That nobody would doubt that if they were at advancing in years, that if they did certain things like, prioritize their sleep and had the right nutritional support, and they were exercising and they were studying, that their body would grow stronger. Well, the same thing with your brain. It's similar to Albert Einstein. His brain wasn't necessarily bigger than everybody else's. His name is obviously synonymous with genius, but there were certain parts of his brain that were more dense. He would do these thought experiments, these creative experiments where he'd visualize, I don't know, like sitting in class and riding on a light beam towards the clock and imagining what the clock would look like at that speed. And, he would do these mental experiments. And luckily he had some left brain logic, be able to put it to science and formulas. But the idea behind this taxi cab, this phenomenon, is that we could grow older, but we could grow more mentally fit. And whatever we're practicing, in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our own behaviors, even to a degree, the emotions that we're feeling on a regular basis, whatever we're training, we're going to get better at. Right. And those behaviors, those thoughts are going to be more fit and more durable, if you will.
The Better Brain Blueprint is all about empowering you to lead a longer, better, happier, and healthier life. No matter your health history, you have the ability to improve your brain function right now by incorporating the information from this series into your daily life. This cutting-edge information just isn't available anywhere else. And that's why owning all of the expert interviews, the transcripts, and the supporting materials is so incredibly valuable. I highly recommend making the Better Brain Blueprint, along with the bonus materials, part of your family library. By making some simple lifestyle changes, you can create lasting improvements in your health and in your life. These changes may not only lower your risk for conditions like Alzheimer's, and mood disorders, they will almost certainly improve your brain function right now. You might notice that you start thinking more clearly, forgetting less, and generally feeling better throughout the day. Sometimes the hardest part in taking action and making these lifestyle changes is figuring out where to start. If you're ready to start right now, the bonus materials include resources that will help you apply this knowledge to your life, one step at a time. We interviewed the world's leaders in general brain health, mood disorders, Alzheimer's disease, and more. And we received some fantastic, actionable information from each of our experts. Unfortunately, we didn't have room to include it all in this series, but we know it's critical, life-changing information that has the power to transform your health. That's why the bonus materials also include the full-length interviews from all of the experts you've seen throughout this series. The great thing about owning this series is that you can easily share it with friends and family and watch their lives change too. In fact, if you found this series helpful, I invite you to share this broadcast event with a friend or with your loved ones. You just might change their lives and their destiny. The most important investment in your life is an investment in your health. Click the button on this page to invest in your Better Brain Blueprint today. The structural, electrical, and chemical functioning of our brains is certainly complex stuff. As always, my goal is to make sure you're being given practical ways to turn this science into a better brain. Let's explore the tools and tips that can help translate our brain workings into steps to enhance your brain health and protect your brain function. So how does optimizing your brain boost everything from sports performance to mood and cognition? Let me give you an amazing example of how daily brain exercises can enhance your brain. In a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association on July 14th of 2023, researchers looked at a host of lifestyle factors and then mapped them against risk for dementia in a population of over 10,000 elderly adults. And they looked at how they spent their time. Over the course of 10 years, they found that a number of variables were predictive of lower risk for dementia. These included writing letters, journaling, using a computer, taking classes, playing cards, chess, or doing crosswords. Even reading books or listening to music helped. The point here is that little things can have major benefits when it comes to protecting and optimizing our brains. What about short-term benefits? Across a host of studies, researchers have found that short bouts of physical exercise can enhance cognition, and we know that exercise is an amazing prevention tool for dementia. This means that moving our bodies each day helps enhance our brain power right away and for decades to come.
We can do things such as, exercise, sleep, proper nutrition, proper sunlight. This is going to help with the vasculature of our brain. And if you can imagine, I often refer to sport, okay, because I work with elite athletes. If you've ever seen Michael Jordan play, or even LeBron James, sometime throughout the game, let's just say they're playing for a 20-minute game, about 2 or 3 minutes in that game, they are in complete flow. Okay, it's like this flow state where everything is just bounding to them naturally. They're able to free throw. They're able to see their opponents. They're able to see their teammates. They're able to move in a way that you look at them and it's just beautiful and just fluid. That's what it's like for your brain when it's performing at its peak. So when your brain is thriving and you've slept well, you've been exercising, you're feeding your brain well, you feel fundamentally amazing. It's like a euphoric state. And I wouldn't say it's like, ecstasy, like being on drugs, but you just feel clear. You've got clear of mind. You're able to think on the spot. You're able to process information and you don't feel lethargic. That's what it means to have a high performing brain, and apart from disease states. And it all starts with the function of the brain.
GABA is central to how we can support ourselves through anxiety. And I think of GABA as an endangered species of modern life. We don't have proper GABA functioning in our brains. And a lot of the things we reach for when we're anxious, it's our body's wisdom, really. It's reaching for GABA on some level. When we reach for alcohol, that's trying to support an anxious brain with an influx of GABA. When we reach for the benzodiazepine medications, things like Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, those are GABAergic agents as well. And the tricky thing here is that it's the wisdom of the body knowing I need GABA support, and it reaches for one of those agents. But these kinds of substances in certain ways overshoot. And then we have so much GABA in the brain that in our body's attempt to restore homeostasis, we then overcorrect and we leave ourselves more anxious afterward. So like we just described with alcohol and its impact on sleep, I call that hangxiety the day after drinking, which is this GABA to glutamate conversion where now we're left with less GABA in our brain than we started off with. And that's part of why we feel anxious sometimes after drinking. I want to be very emphatic that I do not recommend that anybody make any changes around benzodiazepine usage on their own. It's something you'd want to work really closely with a practitioner with to make sure that you're doing it safely, because it can be a potentially dangerous withdrawal. But I also just want to support anybody who is on benzos and feels like their anxiety is getting worse or there's almost more fragility to their brain. I want them to realize that that can be interdose withdrawal, that they're on this medication that their doctor prescribed for anxiety, and it helps while you're on the medication, but then as it washes out of your body, you're feeling more anxious or panicky or even a sense of despair or irritability, and that's very likely a withdrawal effect.
As we just heard, drinking alcohol may not be the best choice when it comes to brain health, due in part to its effects on GABA. On the flip side, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, keeping our brains active each day is an amazing tool to stay sharp well into our later years. This means prioritizing brain-stretching activities each day, like doing puzzles, playing an instrument, or learning something new.
The two big declines that we see in cognitive performance happens when people graduate school because somehow they associate education and learning. Their education is done, so their learning is done. And obviously we know that's not the case for anyone watching this right now and listening because you prioritize learning. And then the second time in our life when you see a drop is usually when people retire. Often when people retire, their careers, they retire their mind. And unfortunately, their body is not usually that far behind. And so kind of like that's the ecosystem that we're looking at. And once you kind of label it, you see it, it's not invisible anymore. And then you could prioritize the things that help you to be able to focus, to be able to remember the things that are good for your brain, to help you to, again, catch up, keep up, and get ahead.
So we know it's important to stay intellectually engaged throughout our lifespan, regardless of whether we're engaged in formal education or a career, or even a daily crossword puzzle. Each day, your brain wakes up hungry for new information. Yet in order to properly grow and thrive, our brains need the right building blocks, the right neurotransmitters, and the right amount of energy. Since our brains and our neurotransmitters are built from and directed by our dietary nutrients, this is a great reason to try to make sure your diet is varied and nutrient-rich. Consuming a range of minimally processed food is an excellent way to ensure you're getting good nutrient coverage for your brain. And in particular, it may make sense to shoot for around 2 grams of daily omega-3 fatty acids, including EPA and DHA, which can be found in fish, algae, and to a lesser extent, plant foods like nuts and seeds. Another really important step is to minimize your exposure to toxins in the environment that can damage your brain function. We'll dive deep into this topic in episode 8. From an energetic perspective, we really have to pay attention to our brain's power centers, the mitochondria. You'll be learning about the health of your mitochondria in episode 3, but suffice it to say that our modern day lifestyle and diet tends to be anything but optimized for the trillions of mitochondria in our brains.
The brain has more mitochondria per cell than any other organ. Mitochondria is where you make energy. You turn sugar, protein, or fat into energy, combining with oxygen in the form of ATP. And that powers everything in your body and your brain. And if your mitochondria stop working, you die. Basically, if you take cyanide, for example, poison your mitochondria, you're dead in a few minutes, right? So it's not hard to understand why energy is so important for the body. And when you look at the brain in particular, and you see brain diseases, they're often mitochondrial diseases. Suzanne Go, I think is her name. She was at Harvard and Oxford. She was an autism researcher, a pediatric neurologist, and looked at functional MRI imaging and very fancy kind of brain imaging that looked at mitochondrial function. She found a lot of these kids with autism had an energy problem in the brain and had very low energy. And she gave them a whole cocktail of mitochondrial supplements like CoQ10 and so forth that actually help these kids improve their cognitive function and kind of reverse some of the autistic symptoms. Same is true in Parkinson's. It's a mitochondrial disorder. It's in the basal ganglia, but it's a mitochondrial issue. And often using mitochondrial therapies can be really helpful for Parkinson's. Same thing with Alzheimer's. So basically, I think we really have to take care of our mitochondria, and we have to understand that if you want to have a healthy brain, you got to focus on your mitochondria.
Another really interesting area of research concerns the need for our brains to be connected to the world around us, in order for us to have healthy connection and function within. This is really important stuff. If we want to have high functioning brains, and we do, we need to invest in our relationships. Now, I'm not saying you have to run out and start talking to strangers, but having a network does turn out to be a great thing for our brain health, which can be as simple as taking more time out of your day to call a loved one, join a book club, or attend a local event in your community. When you combine the power of deep relationships with commitment to new learning, you've got an incredibly potent 1-2 punch that can help support a high-functioning brain into your 10th decade and well beyond.
There was a study also on longevity and new learnings. I don't know if everyone saw this. They took these nuns that were living 80, 90 and above, and they wanted to find out what was the key to the longevity. And they found half of it was their emotional faith and gratitude, but the other half, they were lifelong learners. They were reading, they were having deep conversations and study groups. And because of it, it added years to their life. But not only that, life to their years. The study was actually on the cover of Time magazine. The study was called Aging with Grace. Beautiful title for a study. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how much are we learning every single day? My favorite is reading.
I know we've covered a good amount of technical information in this episode, so I want to take a moment here to regroup and review. And don't worry, we'll be returning to many of these topics in detail in future episodes. We talked about the incredible billions of cells in your brain, which are split roughly 50-50 into neurons and glial cells. We spoke in particular about the microglial cell, an immune cell in your brain that responds to and can generate or reduce inflammation in the brain. We talked about the 4 lobes of the brain, which include the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, the parietal lobes, and the occipital lobes. We spoke about the key role of the frontal lobes and the hippocampus in dementia, and mentioned the amygdala and its role in mood disorders. We spoke about neurotransmitters and how they transfer data around the brain, and then we talked about the role of lifestyle factors in positively influencing all of these systems. Specifically, we focused on the key role of daily learning, exercise, and connection as tools to keep our brains in top shape. I briefly mentioned the importance of diet, but as you likely already know, this is a big topic in brain health, and we'll be getting into a whole lot more detail in the next episodes, where we'll talk about metabolism, nutrients, the gut-brain connection, and so much more.
Brain health matters because without our brain, the rest of our body doesn't function. Having a healthier brain feels as though you have your life in control and joy at your fingertips.
Brain health is fundamentally, in my opinion, the most important organ in the entire body. It is telling your entire body what to do and when to do it. And if you think about what the brain actually is, it's, 3 pounds of, think about this, 3 pounds of hard jello, I like to describe it as, and it's made up of around 87 billion neurons. Each of these neurons, their brain cells or nerve cells, has around 30,000 connections. So your brain is operating at an enormous speed, and it takes a lot of energy. And if it's not functioning well, meaning from a functional perspective and a structural perspective, if these two things that make up the brain are not functioning well, this can lead to a decline in cognitive functions. This can lead to a decline in our overall health. This can lead to increased rate of neurodegenerative diseases. So I think that every single person should be prioritizing the health of their brain, because it fundamentally is going to put you in a position to thrive for as long as possible.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Better Brain Blueprint. I'm Dr. Austin Promoter, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next episode.